Hey guys, Kuzo here, back with another video, and in this video today we're going to be doing another big splash page for Kimetsu no Yaiba. Last splash page I did for this series, I added in Tanjiro and Nezuko, but in this one I wanted to do just Tanjiro and kind of pull in closer for an action scene. As you guys can probably already tell, I decided to draw this illustration in landscape instead of portrait because the initial idea I had for the pose I felt would definitely fit into landscape much more than portrait because it's more of a kind of longer horizontal sort of position with the way he's holding his sword and everything. This is the first landscape drawing I've done on here in quite a while. In fact, I think it's one of the first landscape drawings I've gone from start to finish on here for a long time. I don't even know if I've done a landscape drawing on here, maybe way far back, but nothing recently, that's for sure. Wait, I correct myself. I did one recently with Natsu. I did do that one. And who knows, maybe there's more. But with landscape drawings, they're actually really fun to play with because you can play with composition really nicely when you're doing these kind of longer illustrations, and especially things with longer weapons. Depending on how they're holding it, because this one he's holding it long ways across the screen, and it's actually really weird that I said screen because I'm thinking of it like as if it's a movie or something, but it's on a piece of paper, it's not a screen. But for those of you who made it to the end of my last video and remember me talking about running out of ink and stuff during that illustration, I was just using all those pens to try to make sure I could finish it, and then I started talking about using the G pen and I got really excited about that. Well, I am actually going to be using the G pen to ink this illustration. Yeah, that's what I'm going to be using to ink this, and I'll talk a little bit more about that once that portion comes up in the video. But to talk a little bit about the beginning stage of the illustration, I was pretty much just thinking about him holding the sword in somewhat of an action pose and wanting the water to kind of fly around that whole bottom part and swirl around the sword and stuff. And I really love doing these action poses, and it's funny because most of this channel actually doesn't have really dynamic action poses on it, weirdly enough. It's one of the things that I love drawing the most, and it's one of the things I drew the most when I started drawing. I tried to draw these kinds of poses the most, even when I didn't know how to draw them as well. I don't know why I haven't been drawing more of them for this channel, because they're definitely a lot more fun, and they're definitely a lot more interesting and more poppy. And I've already explained a little bit about the redesign series and why I don't really do it with that, but who knows, maybe I'll actually just try to do some of these action poses with the redesign series as well. Actually, inking these illustrations has been really fun. It definitely takes a lot more time on the videos, but it's definitely, I feel like it's definitely worth it. Doesn't mean there's not going to be any sketch videos, but I definitely want to be able to finish certain illustrations for videos that I feel like it would be a lot more fun if they're completely done. When I say completely finished, I mean, you know, black and white ink, because my colored illustrations are actually all done digitally, and I know my digital videos on this channel don't do as well, but I still post some here and there, so, I mean, for those of you who are interested in my, you know, colored videos or my digital coloring videos, or my digital videos, I still do those, you know, now and then on this channel. And I do plan to do a lot more of those, as well as, you know, keep on keeping on with the traditional stuff as well too. Who doesn't want a little bit of variety? You know what I'm saying? But to get back to the illustration a little bit, right now I'm just doing the water and stuff like that. I didn't know exactly how I wanted to do it, so I kind of just put a general area in where I want it to be, and I feel like it could have benefited if I actually, you know, drew out the water a little bit more close to how I wanted all the ripples and stuff like that to work. But recently I've been working a little bit looser with my line work, which I do want to get it back to being a little bit more clean, because sometimes it is hard to work with when it gets really loose. But now we have moved on to the inking section with the G pen. For those of you who do not know what a G pen is, it is pretty much just a dip ink pen, and it's pretty much the standard pen that most mangaka that work traditionally use to ink their manga pages and whatnot. This one specifically isn't just your normal G pen, it's the Zebra G pen, and I believe most mangaka use the Zebra G pen because the normal G pen is quite scratchy, and it just doesn't have as big of a range as the Zebra G Pen. And funny story, I actually bought the normal G Pen at first, and I started using it, and it was very scratchy and very strange, and I was like, man, how do they even ink with this? This is quite difficult. And I ended up getting the Zebra G Pen, and I was like, oh, this makes a little bit more sense. The pen that I'm using here is still scratchy though, especially compared to a Micron or a ballpoint pen or any other sort of marker that you may have used, because there's just a certain kind of friction, you know, when it comes to metal on paper. It still does run really smooth on the paper, it's just not as smooth as these other pens. So it's a bit jolting when you actually switch over to something like this, and you may have a bit of a problem at first, especially with the width variants, because this has a whole different range of width than, let's say, Micron, because Micron's has all these different sizes. Well, the G Pen can actually reach the sizes of a lot of those pens, and also reach a smaller size than those pens because it feathers out when you push harder. This may not be something a whole lot of traditional artists are used to, especially when they're using markers and stuff like that. Someone who's using a brush pen definitely already knows that feeling, but someone who's using pens and stuff like that, it's definitely going to be something you would have to get used to. But it's something that I really like a lot, because if you notice throughout this whole illustration, I can ink this whole illustration with just this G Pen because it has such a wide width variant. I feel like that's one of the things that makes this pen so good, is because it can have that range, and that's why you can ink almost a whole manga page with just this pen. And I'm not talking about like blackouts and stuff like that, but mostly just the line work. But I do want to talk about the ink that I'm using, because the ink that I'm using, I mentioned in my last video, I had for a long while, and one thing I was worried about was it being too thick, because when you have ink, you know, it starts, you know, drying out a little bit, and I have a big bottle of it. And I have a little ink container that I use for when I'm actually using the G Pen, and I just fill that with the big bottle. And I had actually filled that ink bottle a little while ago, and I went to just use it from that ink bottle. I started to ink the illustration a little earlier. It was going pretty well, and I really liked it. I liked how it was going, but once I got to the water part, I started doing these much longer, broader strokes, and one thing I noticed was my lines started to break very frequently. It started to become a big problem because I wasn't able to get really fluent strokes going, really long fluent strokes for this water. And it started making me really frustrated, and I was almost about to go on and use a Micron. But I thought about how I filled up that ink bottle not too long ago, but I feel like it was just long enough that the ink inside of it could have been thickened a lot more than I thought. And it definitely was, because I dumped it out and I filled it up with ink from the big bottle, and it turned out to work out really well after that. I was able to get longer strokes, much broader strokes, and started saving everything. I was like, thank you. And the rest of the illustration started becoming really fun. I was just playing around with the G Pen, kind of feeling the width of it and just getting used to it again. And I definitely think I'm going to be using this to ink a lot of my illustrations going forward, just because of, you know, the range it can have. You can pretty much just use this pen for the line work, and then just go in with a permanent marker or a brush pen and do the blackouts. And that doesn't mean I don't like the Microns or anything, because I still really do like using Microns. They're very accurate and they're very nice, very reliable. But for now, as long as I have this ink and these G pens, I think I'm going to be going with this for a little bit. I will say it was definitely more of a challenge inking it with this G Pen at first, because I was also a little bit nervous with using it. As many of you may know, the ink when you're using dip ink pens takes a lot longer to dry on a piece of paper than a Micron. A Micron kind of just absorbs into the paper, and depending on how thick your ink is, this ink tends to lay on top of the paper and take some time to dry. A lot of the problems you have when you start off with this is just rubbing your hand over something you just inked, and then you just smear the whole thing. Luckily, the ink I use is called Indian black ink, and it actually dries relatively fast. And that also depends on how absorbent your paper is. This paper is a little bit more absorbent than your traditional manga paper. Your traditional manga paper is a lot smoother than this bristleboard paper. This bristleboard paper is still very smooth, but not as smooth as the manga paper that I've used. The reason why I'm mentioning smoothness is because typically when a piece of paper is more rough, ink and paint and stuff like that tend to be able to absorb into rougher paper easier than really smooth paper. And like I said, even though this is very smooth, the manga paper is so smooth that the ink kind of just lays on top of it and doesn't really absorb, which I do kind of like when it just lays on top, and even though it takes longer to dry, it gives this really dark ink vibe in person. When you're looking at it, it looks very nice. Like I said, on this paper in some parts it absorbs in a little bit more, so the black is a little bit more dull, but that's not going to actually affect the scanning in quality. That's only something you notice in person. But to talk a little bit more about the illustration, what's going on here in the stage is I'm pretty much just in the shading in stage. And like I've said before, when I'm not as confident with where the shades are, should I say blackouts actually, where the blackouts are going to be going in, I typically go in with a pencil just to give myself a rough idea of where I want to put them. So that's what I was just doing there. And now I'm actually going in to fill in those blackouts. And I do a majority of the hair with just the G pen. But yeah, something else I wanted to mention is I actually had someone ask me on my last Kimetsu no Yaiba illustration, where can I find this image in the manga? And I was a little surprised by that, but also not surprised as much, because I do know there's a lot of copy artists on YouTube that kind of just copy screenshots of the anime or from the manga and stuff like that, and it's become a lot more normalized on the platform. But none of my illustrations here are copies of other illustrations from the manga or from the anime. These are things I come up with on my own. The only time I copy other illustrations is when I'm doing studies, and that's for my own learning purposes, and I actually don't post those online. But yeah, just in case any of you are wondering, this is not in the manga and this is not in the anime. So I don't use reference or anything like that when I'm drawing these illustrations. I'm talking about reference for poses and stuff like that. I do make sure to go and look at the character to make sure I'm drawing their costume correctly, but as for pose reference, no, I don't use pose reference. If there's something I don't know how to draw, I make sure to go find that thing, and I find it, I study it, and I draw it over and over and over and over and over again. And when you learn that thing, on top of learning the basics of art and the fundamentals, at that point, when you know the basics, fundamentals, and perspective and form and stuff like that, when you learn those specific things and you learn how to draw an arm from different angles, you end up being able to learn how to draw that arm from any angle, or that body from any angle. But yeah, that's pretty much the process in learning how to draw anything, and pretty much learning how to do anything. You start off with the basics and then you go into the more complicated things. And that's pretty much what I just explained there. And that's kind of a good thing to take on in anything in life, because everything starts with the basics and then builds up from there into the more complicated parts of that specific subject. And as much as people don't really think of art as something as a learning subject, it is definitely something where you just have to learn a lot of stuff and put in a lot of practice. And one thing I often like to say is mastering the fundamentals is the difference between being just a good artist or being someone who can become a master. Hey, apparently I'm just some anime artist on the internet. What do I know? Just go look at Kim Jong-gi for that example. He's a perfect example of it. Back to the illustration a little bit. I've pretty much just used the G pen for this whole illustration, as well as a brush pen. And I think I brought in a permanent marker there for a second, but I've pretty much only used those other two throughout the whole illustration. It really kind of simplifies things, because then you can just try to get really good at this one tool and the other one's just for filling. And that's kind of how I like to keep my digital tools too. There's only 3 or 4 pens that I might use. As for inking line art, there's pretty much only one pen I use for that. When it comes to coloring an illustration, I'll typically use like 1 or 2, maybe 3 different kinds of brushes, because I'll have my regular brush and then maybe some sort of really soft brush. In any case, if you guys want to help support my artists and help support what I do on this channel, you guys can check me out on my Patreon, link in the description. I'd like to thank all my Patreons. You guys are the best Pinterest nobodies around, and special thanks to my Chunin and Jonin tier Patreons: Satoshi, Alpha Dog Studios, Benjamin T, Jeffrey Riddle, Yulia Namikaze, Wear My Crown, Daniel Hillier, Maricuzio, JT, Aaron McQuiston, Slow Days, Aaliyah Williams, Ryan, Johnny Boy Draws, Liquor, Weeb Ninja, Leo McIntyre, Joe, Daniel Hutchinson, Urgin, David DeBoer, Jaden Syria, Fabsy, Lost Illustrator, and Paul Hrubeck. Big thanks once again. You guys all help me be able to do what I do on this channel. But in any case, if you guys like this video, please hit that thumbs up button. And if you're new to this channel like you see, please subscribe, hit the bell icon, and get notified when each video comes out. And like always, guys, I hope you're having a great day, and I'll see you guys in the next video.